my answer is very, very simple. The proper epistemology of religion is exactly that of science, without exception. Not similar, but exactly the same. Because I think the epistemology of everything is exactly the same, and it's approximately described by Bayesian confirmation theory. And that the axioms of standard probability theory, as axiomatized by Kolmogorov or other people, are regulative ideals for degrees of belief. And so, so rather than try to untangle the stuff from Tom's opening monologue, I would like to actually hear him tell me what are some things that he thinks he knows. Oh, I didn't give my example. So, for example, so I'll say I know. I think I know that humans and chimps share a common ancestor. I think I know there are other planets. I think I know that there are atoms and subatomic particles. More importantly, I think it's very probably true that those things exist and behave approximately the way that contemporary physics says they do. I think chemistry is approximately correct in what it says about water boiling and things like that. I think biology is fundamentally correct in what it says about the history of evolution. And I think physics is largely correct about what it says about the atomic world and the subatomic world. And so those are examples of things I think I know. And I'm wondering if Tom thinks he knows those things.
All right, I would take the position of confusing the map and the territory. I'd say that those are descriptions of our phenomenological experience of reality, but we can't justify the claim those are in fact reality itself, like a distinction between Kant's phenomenal and noumenal. Like, I would grant that I probably believe that they are reality, but I can't demonstrate or justify that kind of a claim. The things I would say I know, you asked, like, what would I claim that I know? I know that I think, therefore I am, and I would grant things like logical truths, A equals A, law of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, mathematical truths, those kinds of things.
So if somebody asks me, hey, if they say, hey, do you know whether or not humans and chimps share a common ancestor? I say, yeah, I do. I do know that. What do you say? Do you know?
I would agree with that, but I'd use a different definition of no. So I would ask, do you know we're not in the Matrix? And to which pretty much every scientist would say, no, we can't know that. But science doesn't care. Science doesn't ask those kinds of capital T truth claims. Science only cares about the phenomenological.
So I think that's wrong, and I think it's not just wrong; it's clearly and almost scandalously wrong. It might be true of some physicists, but to say that it's true that generally, I think, is demonstrably false. Certainly false of the physicists that I have had physics and philosophy lunches with for, I don't know, 17 years. It's certainly false of the folks at Rochester, at the Laser Institute there, where they do high energy physics. It's certainly false of the particle physicists at St. Louis University have been influenced by Jaynes. It's certainly false of there's a guy at UT that I know fairly well in condensed matter physics there. It's false for Gerald Cleaver. So I don't think that's largely true. But you're using a lot of terminology that you say things like truth with a capital T and stopping point for truth. And Tom, I got to say, I think you're flying a little high there, man. I think you need to keep it a little closer to the ground. So I'm thinking somewhere in here I've got the School of Athens and Plato's looking up to the heavens. Well, I'm an Aristotelian, man. I'm pointing straight down to the ground. And as an Aristotelian, I think, look, so Aristotle defined truth very simply in a series of monosyllabic terms so everybody could understand them. This is approximately a correct translation. He who says of that which is that it is, or of that which is not that it is not, speaks truth. He who says of that which is that it is not, or of that which is not that it is, does not speak the truth. Or as Mortimer Adler put it, it's just getting your is and your is not lined up. Okay, so truth isn't complicated. It's a very simple concept. It's basically when the subject term of your sentence, the thing that your subject term refers to, has the property that your predicate term refers to. It's just getting it right. So when you talk about stopping point for truth, I literally don't know what you mean. Like, and I'm not trying to be coy. I'm not trying to be cute. I'm not trying to be a smart aleck. It's just stopping point for truth is not a term that I would ever use or think about using, nor is the phrase truth with a capital T. So I just don't know what you're talking about. And it bums me out because it seems like these notions are pretty fundamental to your view, and yet I don't have a clue what you're saying.
Are you familiar with Kant's phenomenal noumenal distinction?
I am, but why don't you explain it to me?
All right, so the noumenal is the way reality really is, and the phenomenal is our appearance of reality, or the model of reality constructed as far as we can tell. Is that a fair definition?
I mean, I don't need some German logician, some wordy German logician to explain to me the difference between reality and appearance. I understand that there's such a thing as misleading evidence. Sometimes things aren't as they appear. Sometimes our senses are misleading. Okay, so what? I mean, guess what, Tom? I know I'm not in a matrix. I know that I share a common ancestor with chimpanzees, and I don't need some special cosmic, thing to tell me that. I read Darwinists and I read basic biology. I don't know why we got to bring Kant into it. Yeah, sometimes things aren't what they appear to be, but most of the time they are. Why think otherwise? Why,
so you said,
why don't you think you're not in the matrix? I think that's crazy.
So you said you didn't understand what I meant when I said a stopping point for truth. Well, what I meant was the noumenal phenomenal distinction. That's what I'm talking about. So the reason I brought that up was in order to explain to you what I'm talking about.
All right. Well, the concept of a stopping point for truth plays absolutely zero role in my theorizing about the epistemology of anything.
Okay.
Just zero. I mean, all I care about is about the only word you used that I was able to track was tentative. Now that I understand, because I'm a probabilist. In fact, I'm a radical probabilist. I take a lot of heat. Whoa, did you hear that thunder? Holy cow. I take a lot of heat from certain schools of epistemology because I don't believe that I can be certain of anything. Not even I think, therefore I am. Not technically certain. Okay, so I'm what's called a radical probabilist, a term that was coined by Richard Jefferies, who's kind of my philosophical hero. And so everything that I believe tentatively, but that doesn't mean I don't believe it's actually that way. I mean, technically, my belief in evolution is tentative, but that doesn't mean I don't believe it, and it certainly doesn't mean I don't know it. It just means that fallibilism is true, that knowledge doesn't entail certainty. That's actually a big part of what my dissertation was on, was the proposition that knowledge does not entail certainty. Do you think knowledge entails certainty?
Only of certain kinds of claims. So I take the science.
I didn't ask you that. I asked you if knowledge entailed certainty, Tom.
Only of certain kinds of claims. So knowledge can have different classes. I can say I have knowledge that I am imagining a unicorn. Does that require certainty? No. Do I have knowledge that we are evolved from apes and we have a common ancestor? Does that require absolute certainty? No. I can say that's empirical knowledge. I'd classify it as a certain kind of knowledge. But if I said I have knowledge that there is an all-powerful being who is by definition not created, I'd say, yep, that requires absolute knowledge. And if you don't have it, it's unjustified.
Why?
Because
first of all, you said absolute knowledge. I asked you about certainty. You see, I'm
using those as synonyms.
I'm really good at telling when the words change.
I'm using those as synonyms, so you can take them as the same thing. So like you mentioned earlier, you said
in your terminology, absolute knowledge means what?
Like absolute certainty. So absolute knowledge, absolute certainty. So going back to what you said earlier.
Okay, simple question. Why think that? Why all of a sudden, when it gets to a claim you don't like, does certainty required for knowledge? And guess what? I already said I don't care about knowledge. Okay, fine. You don't want me to know that God exists because I can't be absolutely certain? Okay, fine. I don't care. I don't need knowledge for anything.
So I don't think that the divide between the noumenal and the phenomenal is nearly as stark as you think that it is. I think that we do have access to things about ultimate reality. I think that you're reasoning towards something like naturalistic pantheism, towards a necessary being. You are making an ontological claim there that there needs to be some underlying ground. You're not just saying, for all I know. You're actually reasoning about the cosmos or the cause of the cosmos And I think it's good reasoning. I think it's valid. I also think that when you reason that 2 + 2 = 4, that's a metaphysical, ontological claim. It's not just a, well, in this world, in the way that we see it, who knows if that's true or not. And I think the same way that you would want to reason about the laws of logic themselves and the existence of the law of non-contradiction, that you can't have contradictory states of affairs that obtain at the same place in the same time. Those are statements not just about the phenomenal realm. They're statements of truth that are universal, and they're seem to be unrestricted in the way. I don't want to say like, well, the law of non-contradiction, well, it's true in the actual world as I understand it phenomenologically, but who knows if it's true somewhere else. At least when I'm talking about the law of non-contradiction, I'm certainly not talking about it that way. Do you understand yourself to be talking about the law of non-contradiction and mathematical truths not as ontological realities, but merely from an epistemic perspective of phenomenology?
Correct. My position on math and logic is that reality exists and reality is the way reality is, and then we have created these languages of math and logic to describe the way reality is.
Okay, but even the statement
not prescriptive.
Even the statement that you just made is not a claim about your appearance. Reality is the way that reality is. That's a metaphysical claim.
Well, I would go with Descartes and say that I would reject the possibility of even like 1 + 1 = 2, because there could be an evil deceiver and I could be wrong even about that. So I wouldn't say that even those are necessarily metaphysical claims. Those are claims about the phenomena, about the world we experience.
Claim. You're saying that it could be this other way. You're making a claim about modality. You're making a claim about what could be and what could not be. That is a metaphysical claim.
Right. I'm happy to say that metaphysics could be any way. The point that we can't make any claims about metaphysics is that we can't say it is one way, because it could always be any other way. And so my position about, you said the necessary thing.
It could be any way. You don't think that it could exist in a logically contradictory way. You don't think it could be the case that we are both talking and not talking at the same time, do you?
Oh, right. I say that logic is a description of the way reality is. So I don't think that reality can be not reality.
Do you think it's a true description of the way reality is? Or is it just a phenomenal? Is it a new?
I consider those to be the same thing. The true isn't like a capital T true. It's just a phenomenal true. It's true insofar as we can tell, true to our minds or how our brains work. But I would not go so far as to say that logic is fundamental, is metaphysical part of a reality. It's not. It's just a language. It's just a language. That's it. You asked, what reason is there to justify the claim that you need absolute knowledge for claims of what I call stopping points for truth, right?
Yeah.
All right. So it's what you said earlier. Your quote about you must proportion your belief to the evidence. Don't remember exactly what you said, but I believe it was the Laplace one.
It's the gist.
Right. So if you're making a claim of like something being all powerful or uncreated, you need absolute knowledge. Like if I claimed there was a being who knows absolutely everything, then I would need to know absolutely everything to know there's not something he doesn't know.
Why I think that is a fallacy. I think that's a non sequitur. I see zero reason to believe that the content, just because the content of the belief has an infinity in it, that doesn't mean the evidence needs to. If somebody tells me that there's a aleph naught number of fundamental particles, I'm going to say, oh, that's an interesting claim. Why do you think that? And then they'll give an argument, and we'll go back and forth. But I'm not going to say to somebody, oh, you postulate, countably many particles. Well, you're going to need infinite evidence for that. It's just an absolute non sequitur to go from an infinity in the content to an infinity in the evidence. It's just an absolute non sequitur.
Right, I agree, and that's not what I'm saying. So I'm saying what requires the infinite evidence to say there is an alpha null number of particles, but there is not an alpha null plus 1 number of particles. That's the claim that requires the infinite evidence, because then you have to take all of the alpha null and then know everything outside of the alpha null and know there's nothing there. You're claiming to have absolute knowledge there and say there is not an alpha null plus 1 anywhere. That requires absolute certainty. That's an absolute claim.
Why? Why does that require absolute certainty? I mean, because it almost sounds like you're saying that the reason why, because sometimes people will say you have to have omniscience to make a negative existential claim, which you really don't. But I really want to hear you explain this, because it makes absolute zero sense to me that this kind of claim would require some kind of absolute evidence. It's a non sequitur. There's no like law proportioning. There's a law proportioning strength of belief to strength of evidence, but not strength of evidence to like scope of claim. I mean, anytime anybody makes a negative existential claim, they're sort of, in a sense, claiming to know all of reality. If I say there's no crows that are purple with pink spots, well, guess what? I mean, technically, I've made a claim about everything that exists, but I don't need some kind of special evidence for that. In fact, I don't need anything special evidence-wise for that. In fact, I dare say, Tom, I claim right now, live in front of everybody, there are no purple crows with pink polka dots.
And do you have absolute knowledge of that?
I don't know what absolute knowledge is.
Then I would say no, you cannot say you have... Right, yeah.
No, I don't know. I'm not. I just told you I'm a fallible.
Right, so then that would not fit the definition of no I'm using. You have a lowercase k no. You don't have the capital K no.
I don't care about the case.
Right.
At all. And I didn't claim to have it. The question, Cameron's question to us wasn't like, what does it take to capital K no? It was, what is the proper epistemology of religion?
Right, and from my perspective, in order to justify claims, since religion entails a God and God has omni properties, you need to be able to justify those. Entail a
God. Atheism or Buddhism is atheistic.
Correct. I'm specifically, when referring to religion, I'm jumping to the conclusion of the Abrahamic theistic religions, because that's usually the content of the show.
You have finite God versions of them.
Sure. I mean, the Pastafarianism is technically a religion, and Satanism is technically a religion, at least by politics.
You don't need an infinite God to raise Jesus Christ from the dead.
Correct. You don't need an infinite God to have a designer to the universe. So that's not
great.
the claims
so
I'm saying.
Let's leave that out of it. Let's say I'm a finite Godist.
That would be great. I am totally okay with that. That would just completely accept everything about my introduction, because all I said was that we have to be a fideist about those omni properties. That was the conclusion of my intro.
But that's not the summation of religion. I think that's highly misleading to say that's your main point, because the question was, what's the proper epistemology of religion? Because I mean, look, I think Jesus rose from the dead. I think I can defend that to a very high degree of probability, such that anybody who doesn't believe it, well, something went wrong somewhere. You okay with that?
That would be the second half of my epistemology. My introduction only presented the first half.
Okay. Holy cow, that was just the first half. All right. Give me the second half then.
So the second half is that there's some difference between our imagination and our experience, and you have to show there's whatever you're explaining isn't of the imagination, is of the experiential kind of thing, the internal-external kind of distinction. So I would reject that your claim that you can show with any probability that Jesus rose from the dead. I would say there is no evidence of that at all.
Why?
Because testimony doesn't qualify as evidence of anything that lacks an empirical basis. So, I mean, miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, no amount of historical testimony will justify any of those things.
So you know that movie Princess Bride?
Yes, that? The one with.
Do you remember?
You keep using that word, but I do not think you know what that word means.
That's right. I'm like Inigo Montoya talking to Vizzini. You keep using this word. I don't think it means what you think it means. I mean, you talk about empirical. What do you mean by that?
Right, I'm talking about my distinctions and stuff that I've written into my epistemology. So I'm using.
Yeah. Okay. Well, tell me about it. What do you mean by the word empirical?
Verifiable through sense experience.
Which senses?
What? Which? The sense experience of the five senses that we have? Are there others?
I think so. So tell me this. You mentioned that you believe, do you believe the transitive property? You gave some mathematical example, but I forget what it was.
Right. A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C.
Yeah, you believe that?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's true by definition.
True by definition? Why do you believe it's true by definition?
Because logic is a formal language, so it's literally...
Why? Well, it doesn't follow from logic being a formal language that that's true by definition. That's a non sequitur.
It's true by definition because logic is a formal language, and we've defined it in such a way that it means that. That's how it is a description of how we think.
That sounds circular. It sounds like you're defining modus ponens thusly. If modus ponens is part of formal logic, then it's reliable. Modus ponens is a form of formal logic, therefore it is reliable. That's absolutely circular.
All claims of knowledge are either circular, infinite regress, or dogmatism, Agrippus for limit, so that's not a problem. As long as epistemic circularity, what's his name? Alston.
Bergman.
William Alston, I think.
Yeah. So say that again. All knowledge is what?
Either circular reasoning, infinite regress, or dogmatism, brute fact. Or dogmatism would entail brute fact and metaphysical necessity.
So which of those is the proposition that humans and chimps share a common ancestor? Is that circular, regress, or dogmatic?
I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it.
Well, we got time.
I'd have to take a great deal of time to really process through the information and go through the foundations of science and which one it is.
Well, forgive me for saying this, but I think that's a problem with your epistemology that you can't label that. I mean, we're talking about evolution, man.
Right.
I mean, just to be sure, just to be absolutely sure to get this off the table. Are you a creationist?
No.
Okay.
Existence seems to be the kind of property that we would say is good for the kinds of instrumental reasons that you've antecedently said, yeah, I'm on board with this much.
Right, I would agree that existing is instrumentally good for other instrumentally good things, but I wouldn't say it's intrinsically good.
Okay, that's fine. I think you can still have a successful modal ontological argument with that.
So to go back to the modal ontological argument, I would still say that maximally great is an arbitrary term, and we could just make up a different definition of maximally great. And if you wanted to show that this actually indicated what you're using to define the term to mean, you would have to show that the alternative definitions are not what reality actually agrees with. So like a reality could adopt the what's his name, Gaskin's definition of that the greatest possible being is one that can create the universe without existing. Maybe that's the one reality actually likes the best, as opposed to your.
But that's a contradiction.
Well, that doesn't make a difference to the argument because it's just a reductio. The point is just
an argument cannot be a successful reductio if there is a contradiction in the argument before you actually get to the reductio. Okay? The only way that you can have a successful argument is that the reductio itself finishes with the non-existent. And no one is going to agree that a maximally great being is one that does not exist.
Oh, right. I'm totally agreeing with you. I'm showing that using your logic of saying if a maximally great being exists, and we can use this structure of the argument to indicate a logical contradiction. The problem isn't with the logical contradiction. The problem is with the structure of the argument.
Very good. So I'm gonna not talk about maximal greatness then anymore. I'm gonna use the premise that you gave. You agreed possibly God exists.
Right, and I would say possibly is also one of those imaginary things. Like possibility, either something exists or it doesn't exist. Those are the only options. Possibility is just a measure of human ignorance. Does it exist or doesn't exist? We don't know.
No,
so possibility from my position.
And now you're contradicting stuff that you said earlier, right? With the whole way where we spent time talking about the framework of the metaphysics of modality and possible worlds and the approach to this. Now what you're saying is you're not in agreement with that.
How so?
Because you're now saying that possibility is just a measure of human ignorance. No. Possibility means there is a possible world that's free of any logical contradiction. That's what possibility means. So I'm going to ask, because there's two contradictory claims being made here. On the one hand, standard modal metaphysics, to say that something is possible is not a measure of ignorance or whatever. It's to say that there is a state of affairs that's free of any logical contradiction. That's one option. Another option is to say that possibility is just a measure of human ignorance. One is an ontological claim that you said you were on board with. Now you're making an epistemic claim. They're not the same thing. So I need to know which one it is.
All right. So I don't really understand the difference necessarily between those two. Like from my perspective, when you say a possibility is a world that doesn't have any logical contradictions, that means it's a possible thing we could imagine being the case.
No, not quite. I think we would want to say that a possible world means that there is a state of affairs, okay? And whether or not the state of affairs is actualized or not actualized is not the question that we're interested in right now. That's the debate between the modal concretist and the modal realist. We're interested in just what is that state of affairs that's possible. And to say that it's possible means ontologically that there are no logical contradictions in it. To say it's a measure of human ignorance or something like that is to make an epistemic claim that for all we know, there's no logical contradiction, but maybe there is one that we haven't discovered yet. Okay, I'm stipulating X hypothesized by definition, right? A possible world, if it is genuinely possible, does not have any logical contradictions, whether we know about them or not. Okay? If there's a known logical contradiction, then obviously it's not a possible world. If there's an unknown logical contradiction, it's also not a possible world. In order to qualify as a possible world, there cannot be any logical contradictions in it. That's
all right, right. I think I see where we're going past each other on this. So when I'm saying it's possible, like the measure of human ignorance, I'm talking about the concretist versus the modal realist kind of distinction. I'm saying that yes, that would fit the definition of a possible world in a modal realist sense, but that world isn't actual. So I'm arguing that yes.
How can you know that? How can that is a metaphysical claim that you're making?
Right. So I let me amend that. I'd say we have no reason to believe that world is actual as opposed to any other possible world.
Very good. I'm on board with you there. I am on board with you that we don't have any reason to know whether that world has been actualized or not.
Right. So I'm arguing that
with issues.
So it's possible that there is a world with. You said you didn't want to use maximally great being, but so it's possible there's a world where there's a maximally great being.
No,
but that world could be one of the non-actualized.
I'm not using terms maximal great. All I'm saying is there's a possible world where God exists.
Okay, so I would say that the possible world that God exists may not be the actual world.
Well, no. If there's a possible world where God exists, then part of what it means to be God is that you would exist at all possible worlds. And the actual world is a possible world. We know that because here we are, right? So if there is a world, even one world, a possible world where God exists, that's something that you have conceded, then if that one world, it doesn't have to be an actual world, it can just be a possible world. God exists in that world. Well, if God exists in that world, then a God who's properly God would exist in all worlds. Therefore, God exists in this world.
Right. Happy to grant all of that. So I'm just going to go in and change.
Right.
Right. So I agree with all of that, but I can show that doesn't work because I can just change the definition of God from like a theistic God to a deistic God or a polytheistic God or a pantheistic God, the naturalistic pantheism.
Well, hang on.
Change the definition of God to mean.
That's not quite right. I want to go back to something that I said, and unfortunately, I'm going to need to go here in 5 or 10 minutes. I want to go back to something that I said at the very beginning, which is that these kinds of natural theological projects, it's not clear to me that they get you to the God of the Bible, right? I believe in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I believe in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. I believe Genesis 1 and John 1. The God that the biblical authors are talking about, I think Yahweh exists. And I just so happen to believe that the God of the philosophers is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Convenient for me, right? But I'm not trying to say that there's any particular definition about God that's here. So the maneuver of playing this game of 3-card Monty, where you're wanting to shuffle things around, doesn't absolve the idea that if possibly God exists, then God exists. If you're on board with leading theorists in modal metaphysics. Now, what that God is, what is the divine nature? Well, that's a whole secondary question, but it's not the same thing as whether or not God exists.
Well, I'm happy to grant it if you're just using it in the vague way where God can mean essentially anything. And then I would just use what I followed up with what you said with, I said, it could just be naturalistic pantheism and in that necessary, eternal, all-powerful nature without consciousness. And if you want to call that a God, I'm happy to grant that and say, yep, I'll grant the ontological argument works equally as well for pantheism as it does for theism.
Well, I mean, there are people who say that negative existential claims have in their scope literally everything that exists, which is in a certain respect true.
Right.
But look, I can say there's no Santa Claus, and I don't need like some sort of special infinite quantum evidence of that, man. I just know there's not a Santa Claus. There's nothing special about it.
Right, and then going along with that, the universal existential negative kind of thing says, actually you do. Actually, you do need to show there isn't a Santa Claus hiding down somewhere in Alpha Centauri that you just don't know yet.
I don't need to show that at all. Have you heard of prior probabilities? They're awesome.
Yes, I have, and I've heard of the problem of the priors too.
Okay. So, but if without priors, you can't really do much of anything. And so you don't have to.
I
You
disagree with
don't. You don't always have to like show that Santa's not hiding on the dark side of the moon. You can assess the antecedent probability of that, and it doesn't even rise to the level of needing to be, ruled out, man.
Well, that's for the part earlier you said you can't be absolutely certain about anything, even I think therefore I am. I
That's right.
definitely disagree with you on that aspect. Like I would say, yes, we can, especially with I think therefore I am. Like, I mean, would you say that there is some probability that you can square root a pork chop? Is there a probability there?
There's a probability greater than zero that my concept of squaring or pork chop is like some evil demon has, deceived me on what those terms mean. But so what? I don't need certainty for anything ever.
Okay, so how could an evil demon stop you from the I think therefore I am thing? How can you not have certainty with that?
I'm saying that I don't have absolute certainty.
Right. I'm saying, how do you not have
deceived about the meaning of the words?
Okay, I guess that's possible, but if we say that that's just the language, ignore the language and assess just the conclusion, like how can I believe I exist and be wrong?
Because the probability is greater than zero that my concept of existence is mistaken, that I've just gotten confused somehow.
Well, my concept of existence is just the thinking. So the fact that I think means I exist. Those are synonymous, essentially, a tautology.
They're not at all, because people can exist without thinking. They're not even close to synonymous.
Right. There could be more to existence than thinking, but thinking is an aspect that demonstrates existence. So there are.
Well, that's still not. That's
it's like
not synonymy.
Not all flowers are roses. Not all, but all roses are flowers.
Yeah, that's got nothing to do with what we're talking about.
All thinking is existing. You can't think and not exist. Even if you can exist and not think, you can't think and not exist.
We're agreed on that. My point is that I don't have any need to be certain about that. I can admit that there's some non-zero probability that somehow some malevolent demon is deceiving me about that, about the very meaning of the terms of my very thoughts, because it takes time to think the thought, and so a demon could be changing, my memory about what the terms mean, or what I said 5 seconds ago, or what the beginning of the sentence was like. But look, my whole point is it doesn't matter that there are possibilities like that. It doesn't make me a skeptic. I know that I think, and I know that I exist, and I know that thinking entails existing. I don't need certainty for any of those things. And I know I'm not in the Matrix, and I know that humans and chimps share a common ancestor, and I know that God exists, and I know that Jesus rose from the dead, and I know there's a heaven. And these are just claims that I assess in the same way that I assess every other claim. I don't need the distinction between appearance and reality is meaningless to this. The fact that Kant gave fancy names to that distinction that was in Plato 1700 or 2000 years before that doesn't mean anything. I don't need appearance to guarantee its truthfulness about reality to believe on the basis of appearances how reality is.
Will and consciousness are essentially synonymous. I'm happy to grant that. So my response would be is that the reason God used his will to create the universe at some particular time is determined by his nature. There's something in his nature independent of his will that determines his will to do this. And I can just get rid of the will and say there's something in pantheism's nature which determines it to do this at a particular time, just like there's something in God's nature which determines him to do this at some particular time.
So, but now there's a contradiction in terms here, right? The pantheism stuff, because on pantheism, like, God is identical with the totality of the universe, and God is everywhere, right? But what we're saying is that this stuff used to not exist. And now you're saying that there must have been something that preceded the existence of that thing. Well, that's God. And whether or not that being is conscious or unconscious, and that's the stuff I'm trying to point you to. Go look at Peter Forrest or Andrei Bukharev or other people who are wanting to develop, or Spinoza himself, right? Non-personal conceptions of the divine. That's not my view of things, and I think that you're going to run into problems, even some of them that we've been discussing here. But that's not the same thing as saying there are no gods, right?
Right, I'm happy to grant that. If you want to say that a non-personal thing qualifies as a god, then I can grant that. I'm okay.
Because you have to talk about something that is not the universe, that is not part of the universe, that is responsible for the universe. Now, on naturalism, the only stuff that exists is the universe. But you would have to postulate something that is supernatural, something that is not part of the natural universe.
No, that's the part I'm rejecting. So there's our universe. Our universe had a beginning, and only our universe. Only the space and time and matter that can be measurable in general and special relativity in the equation.
What accounts for the beginning of that universe?
More natural stuff.
No,
that's what I'm saying.
I mean, we don't have any evidence for that.
Correct. We don't have any evidence for God. Those are on equal footing.
No, I've given you quite a bit of evidence for God.
Right, and I can match that one for one and show it works for the pantheism equally as well as it does for theism.
But that's still a God.
Well, I'm happy to grant that. I'm happy to grant. So it doesn't. So if you want me to be more particular,
at this point, what you need to say is this: we have evidence that it's either God 1 or God 2, but we have zero evidence for no gods.
I'm happy to grant that. We can say there's evidence for either an unconscious, non-personal God or a personal God, and I would say no evidence indicates one way or the other, and I'm happy to grant that.
Okay, but that's not the same thing as atheism. Even on either one of these, you have to say that there is something that accounts for this universe that is not part of this universe. It's supernatural. So you're not a naturalist. You're a supernaturalist.
Well, I think natural things can exist outside of the universe. So I wouldn't say it's supernatural.
So no, this is just an error of simple set theory. Whatever the largest scope of what there is, that is the universe, right? So this universe, and we want to talk about parallel universes and all this. This is why we need to make distinctions about universes versus possible worlds. But if you're wanting to say that this universe exists rests on something else that's more fundamental, right? Okay, then what does that rest on? And are you going to end up with turtles all the way down? And that's just very not satisfying. That's infinite regress. So we need something that's going to finally put a stop to that on pains of violating principle of sufficient reason, right? So God 1 or God 2, either one of those are options. But here's what's not an option. No God. Other natural stuff. Okay, where's that come from? Well, more natural stuff. That's very unsatisfying.
Right. So my response would be is that just like you believe that there is some property of a God that's necessary, eternal, all powerful, I can say those can be natural properties we just haven't discovered yet. They're not supernatural. They're just more natural, undiscovered stuff.
Well, in order to count as natural, they have to be part of the universe. They can't be transcending the universe. That's how we define natural versus supernatural. The stuff that's in the universe is the stuff that's natural. The stuff that's not in the universe, if there is any, that's what would count as supernatural. So for you to say that there is stuff that's not part of the universe, well, by definition, that's not natural.
Well, I think this is going back to where we don't really have a solid definition or distinction between natural and supernatural, because I'm going with the physics definitions here. In physics, the universe is our universe and only our universe. And as soon as you go behind the Big Bang, it's not our universe anymore. There's like the multiverse is not our universe. The cyclic universe is not our universe. String theory is not our universe. Our universe is just...
Yeah, and postulating all that stuff, that's just science of the gaps. Just like, oh, well, we think there's a scientific explanation for this. We just don't know what it is or whatever. Science of the gaps. Okay, if people want to do that, that's fine. I don't think it's rational any more than it is for God of the gaps stuff. If it's an inference to the best explanation, then that's fine. So, yeah.
So yeah, that's essentially what I'm doing is I'm taking the science of the gaps and just adding in the godlike properties of necessary, eternal, all powerful, and just calling them, well, these can be natural too. You don't need the supernatural stuff. So you're right. I'm doing the exact same thing as a god of the gaps here.
But oh, absolutely. It's terrible reasoning. But
yes, it is on both sides.
No, it's not, because I'm not doing God of the gaps. I'm not saying, well, we don't have any explanation of this, so it must be God. I'm saying universes began to exist. All things that begin to exist are caused to begin to exist. Therefore, the universe was caused to exist. What could account for that? Has to be a decision of the will. Why do we know that? Because there's nothing else that could obtain if it was necessary in sufficient conditions that would have happened infinitely long ago. The universe has not been around for an infinitely long period of time. We have good reasons for thinking this. It's not God of the gaps reasoning.
Well, my argument is that I can match everything you